So, Nigel, welcome to the Catalyst building in Newcastle. I don't think we had this facility while you were CEO of CPI.
No.
So it's probably a nice moment just to recognise that Newcastle's always been a really key part of CPI's journey over 20 years. And that journey continues. I would like to go back a bit, though, and just reflect a little on the 20 years. And one of the unique things I think about setting up CPI was the stories I've heard from you about the moment of birth, if you like, and turning up to the Wilton Centre on the very first day with almost literally nothing but your car keys in your pocket and a brief to get on with it. And I'd love to be able for others to hear that story as the start of some reflections on 20 years of CPI.
Yeah, it's actually quite difficult to identify the day that CPI started because there were a number of events. The first one we had to do was to get the money, and that's where Newcastle features much more largely in the history of CPI than we might realise. So I spent a great deal of time in the Regional Development Agency's offices, One North East, writing business plans and getting the money. But I suppose the first day at Wilton Centre was a surprise from a number of perspectives. First was that we actually did have an office. The second surprise, though, was it was my old ICI office. I just could not believe it, that here I was, I'd spent the last 4 or 5 years of my career in ICI, and there we were 2 years after I'd left ICI, back in the same office, starting up CPI. The first thing, though, that was necessary was to recruit another person, which was Val. And I guess starting something from nothing is perhaps best captured in the morning that Val arrived, when she arrived and said, so where's my computer? So I said, here, have mine. And she said, what's my email address? And at that time we were using my personal AOL address. So I created another address on my AOL account and said, right, you're now CPI Val. Gave that to her. And she said, and where's the telephone? And I said, well, here's the telephone directory, phone BT and get one in. And it was literally that basic. That's where we started. The chairman arrived and said, where's my office? And I said, no, it's your desk. Is that one in the corner there? And it was just almost from hand to mouth from the time we were in the Wilton Centre. But there was an awful lot of tripping up here to work with One North East. The day CPI actually came into existence, I think, was the 23rd of December, 2003, when Bob Coxon and I went to the lawyers' offices at Sandgate, and we signed all the documents and put our pounds down and sellotaped them to the documents and agreed that we would start trading CPI on the 1st of April in the afternoon after 12 o'clock, so people didn't think it was an April Fool, on 2004. But the day the company was registered was the 23rd of December, and the day we started trading was the 1st of April. And in between that, a lot of magic happened. It was quite impressive.
Fantastic. One of the phrases that still stays in my mind that when I started at CPI, you used with me, and you used several times over the subsequent years to sort of just keep our collective minds, I suppose, tuned to the purpose of CPI. And the language you used was, if CPI is the answer, what's the question?
Yeah.
And, you know, with your experience over the time at CPI and then subsequently all of the other things that you do in this space between the public and the private sector, I guess, is that still the question?
I think it's even more the question. But the reason why it was a very important question, if I can go back in history a bit further, was how did CPI get to be conceived, not as a baby, but how did the idea come about? And One Northeast, the regional development agency, came up with a plan called the Strategy for Success. And this was all about trying to build on the strengths in the northeast of England to regenerate what was fast becoming a post-industrial region, and also to start closing the GDP gap between the northeast of England and the rest of the country. And in essence, several strategies have been tried before, and I got into terrible trouble for them describing them as the shed building strategy, where very nice buildings were put all around the region in the hope that someone might come and use them. There was the low-cost services strategy, where the Northeast became one of the first call centres in the country because everybody likes the Geordie accent, and it was Lloyds Bank who came first, but they also left first and went to India because it was cheaper. And then the third one was to try and incent companies in with inward investment grants, and that gave rise to Siemens at Silverlink, it gave rise to Fujitsu at Newton Aycliffe, and it gave rise to, name escapes me, but the Korean company at Wynyard.
Yeah.
And almost overnight, the Northeast became the largest possessor on a world scale of empty, unused clean rooms, as all these companies found they couldn't make this work. So One Northeast came up with this strategy of success, which was based on 5 strengths that they had observed in the region. And they were the process industry, the chemical industry, based not just around ICI down on Teesside, but recognising that we'd got Procter & Gamble at Newcastle, we'd got GSK at Barnard Castle, and lots of small companies doing that. The second one was to recognise that Sunderland and Teesside universities were immensely strong in coding, immensely strong in digital games, and immensely strong in the whole use of IT in terms of enabling communication and such like. The third strength was a large research hub that the National Health Service have here in connection with Newcastle University, which was around, in large part, ageing and cancer. The fourth one was to recognise a great strength in microsystems, electronics, photonics, basically the art of quantum mechanics on a chip type of thing. And then the fifth one, there was a strength in terms of shipbuilding and metal bashing, with due respect and apologies to my mechanical engineering colleagues. And that gave rise to, we don't build ships on the Tyne or the Tees or the Weir anymore. So let's think about what we can use those skills for. And there was a great realization that new and renewable energy needed those sort of things. So those 5 strengths combined the industrial legacy, but also the university skills and contributions. And they were envisaged as 5 world-class centres of excellence to be created. There's no point in creating world-class centres of excellence if you can't then stimulate and support business. So it was also envisaged that we would set up a captive funder called North Star, now N-Star Ventures, and much to most people's surprise, a business school, because there's virtually no entrepreneurial spirit in the northeast of England at all. It's all been people who, at the time, were felt to have been employed by large employers, Armstrongs, the shipyards, and so on. So CPI was born out of this world-class centre of excellence. It was the world-class centre of excellence. And One Northeast put this forwards to the government, got the money overall for the programme because it was a devolved programme. It also got itself noted as novel and contentious, and more of that probably later. But the fact about novel and contentious meant that the national interest was stimulated, and the Public Accounts Committee and the Public Select Committee in the House of Commons took a special interest. And the last thing that One Northeast, and particularly the One Northeast CEO, wanted to be was on the carpet in front of the Public Accounts Committee. So we set off from that perspective. They hired 4 world-class CEOs and me. It's interesting to note we're the only one that's really still left. And we went from there. And it was while all that was going on that we were trying to set up the Wilton process. Now, as part of getting that money, we had to say what we were going to do, clearly, and what the outputs were and all the things you need to have to be audited against. And we got an interesting insight into the public sector view of business, which is all about patents and companies started and companies assisted, and a lot of our knowledge from the process industry about what the process industry companies actually wanted. So the first sort of cultural clash, if you will, was most of the process industry practices in secret. It doesn't patent or license, it practices in secret. And this caused a bit of a surprise because most of the other industries practice in public with patent protection and such like. So we had to start dealing with a completely different understanding of how the process sector operated and get that through into One Northeast psyche so it understood how we were going to work. That then gave us the challenge of, well, what were we going to do that we could practice in secret but tell the public sector about to represent what we were being successful at? And we started with a proposal that we would look at working with a company called DuPont Films, where we were trying to help them progress their market building activities in what use polyester film had, because they could see the use in VHS tape recordings and film cameras was falling off a tree, falling off a wall. So where else did their polyester film go? And we also started working with a number of companies about what biomanufacturing could be. Now, the question was, if we were the answer, what was the question? And the question, I think, and still is even more so, is how do you get regional companies to adopt new technology when their headquarters might be somewhere else? So DuPont Teijin Films, a joint venture between DuPont in America and Teijin in Japan. And all the bio companies were really not capitalized at a level where they could be particularly helpful. And it started to become apparent. And I think we either inherited or were very close to inventing the term the Valley of Death, which is this, where you have an idea, how do you get it into commercial production? And that started to become very clear that that was the question to which we were the answer. How do we help technology get from the invention, where somebody has a great idea, through the development to a point where the private sector is prepared to invest? Now that in and of itself is a very simple observation, but it's, when you dig into it, it gets very much more complex. And the first one is, technology will move into the market when private sector capital feels it can make a profit. If it's not in the market, it's because the private sector doesn't think it'll make money with it. So the public sector might be sitting there saying frustratingly, we've got all this technology, why aren't we the world's richest country? And the answer is because it's not been de-risked. But it still needs capital in the early stages. And public sector capital, going back to the novel and contentious bit, without knowing it, has the ability to accept infinite risk. University research is an infinitely risky activity. As Einstein said, if we knew the answer, we wouldn't do it, and it wouldn't be called research. So a lot of what goes on around us is infinitely risky, whereas we were trying to move that to a place where people could make money with it. So if CPI was the answer, part of the solution was, how do we capitalize that route, and how do we bring the public sector and the private sector together? Now, trying to determine the answer to that question, we spent a lot of time looking at Germany, looking at the Netherlands, looking at Singapore, and what we saw there was systematic innovation vehicles, Fraunhofer in Germany, TNO in the Netherlands, and basically the Singaporean government in Singapore. And what they were doing was systematic. They had a process whereby high-risk technology was moved through what we now know as the TRLs, technology readiness levels, all the way through to commercial exploitation. But that was a completely alien concept in the UK at the time, completely alien concept. So once we determined that, we then had to start persuading people that if we were the answer, that actually was the question. Because if you didn't believe it was the question, there wasn't any point in having the answer.
There's a few things there that are interesting there. The One Northeast as the convening entity, if you like, setting the vision, the strategy for success being the articulation of the implementation of that vision, and then the creation of those 5 centres of excellence. So a regional stimulus, but very much with a national in a national context.
Very much so. And if you think about what could help regenerate a region, there is no point in being regionally good or regionally excellent. This wasn't shoot for the moon, this was shoot for the stars. And we just didn't have to be UK good. We had to be globally good. And we set off with a sort of philosophy right at the start of making CPI one of the 4 dots on the world map. So if you're sat in China or India or America, we're on that little list, that short list of places that you would think to go to actually get technology assistance, technology and help. And of course, as soon as you do that, that starts setting the hurdle and the type of people that you need to recruit, the sort of programs that you're going to be doing, the ambition that you're working with. And it also sets something of a time scale as well, because you can't do that if you're expecting results in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. That's a long-term journey. We had to move, or the plan, the vision was we moved the northeast of England from coal mining, building ships, making chemicals, making steel, to a genuinely high-tech based economy with very high-class technology businesses, very high-class technology people and jobs, and with it necessarily the high levels of remuneration. So it was definitely much more than regional, and it was actually much more than national, because you could not succeed if all the strategy was we robbed the southwest to build the northeast, or we robbed London to build the northeast.
And it's really interesting, sitting here, 2024, devolution, post-Brexit, devolution, extremely active, a new mayor now in the northeast, a mayor in the Tees Valley, and we're still articulating the dynamics of regional, national and international through slightly different lenses, but still really with the same fundamentals. What I'm also interested in is obviously we had the regional development agencies, moments in political worlds happen, and the butterfly effect occurs, and what looks like a relatively modest adjustment to distribution of innovation funding turns into a seismic event for CPI and several organisations like us, and that through the shift of tectonic plates gives rise to something called the Catapult. And again, I remember your stories of working with the thinking that went behind that, and the sort of probably slightly imperfect process of creating that, but the very deep thinking that had gone into it as a consequence of looking at Germany and Singapore, and the foundational, or the intellectual quality of the thinking that went into creating something that happily still exists and has grown since. But definitely, it's a little bit like there was day one in CPI and then there was day one in the Catapult network. Yes. And I think that story is also interesting because it's also the biggest part of our shared journey through this, through CPI's 20 years, has been your stimulus, and then are collectively living with the evolution of the Catapult. But again, the creation of the Catapult was a very critical moment.
More than we might realise, and we continue to build on that as a serious opportunity, would be my observation. Around about, I think it was 2010, the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, because Tony Blair had given up after his 10 years, lost the election, and we had our good friends, the Tory party, take the helm. And they had christened already, their first strategy was a bonfire of the quangos. And of course, One North East was a quango. So we ended up, I think there were 6 or 7 regional development agencies, there might have been 8 around the UK. And the Tory government arrived, and there was an immediately huge bonfire, and they were replaced by 33 local enterprise partnerships. And the idea of CPI engaging with 33 local enterprise partnerships was you just couldn't do it. It was beyond the resource that we got. There were also, because of all the work that CPI had done, some very good friends in the Technology Strategy Board, which had been created almost around the same time as CPI. And they knew that there was a lot of centres around the UK that would basically shut up shop in this bonfire of the quangos, because we couldn't manage the cash flow, get the new programme of funding in place, and so on. And we've been working for some time in the background about, if the bonfire of quangos actually happened, what did we need to do? Now, I'm going to join some pieces of history together here, because I can remember the meeting for 2 reasons. When we first set up CPI, there was a thing called the Cambridge MIT Institute in play, which was basically a large amount of money between Cambridge University and MIT to learn from MIT about how they commercialized technology. And as part of that, I got sent to MIT for a course, one of these, work 24 hours a day, sleep when the course is finished type of things. And incidentally, it was also when Netflix, I was at the course where the guys who invented Netflix were on the same course as me. And we were doing a lot of work on that. And one of the guys that we'd got in CPI at that time was Tom Taylor. And he started analysing the American system, which is all publicly available data. And what he discovered was that the investment stage, the invention stage, if that takes $1, then this commercialization stage, the innovation stage, takes $63. And then on to the reward, which is $400 on average. The comparative figures for the UK were 1, none, and 6 at the time. Also at the same time, we were really analysing what we were seeing in the other places. And we had at that point got a director from Fraunhofer on CPI's board. And what we learned was that Fraunhofer operated a joint public-private funding model for their innovation centres, where the German government put in a third of the cost, the regional government put in a third of the cost, and industry put in a third of the cost, which was what was called the 2/3, 1/3 model. And that was also done by TNO in the Netherlands. And we were operating that model as part of the business plan with CPI as far as we were allowed, which was it had to be 50-50, 50 public, 50 private, or we would have been state aided. And the fact that Germany and the Netherlands were state aiding was grandfathered. It was just not even touched on. It was allowed to continue. So we got to a stage where the model was established, the overall sort of return potential was established, and we were facing this bonfire of the quangos. The TSB at the time was also wondering what, if it was the answer, what was the question? And Colin Harrison, who sadly is no longer with us, was a non-exec of CPI. at the time, and I went down to Swindon to see Ian Gray and David Bott, CEO and Chief Technology Officer, and we pitched a model at him, which was, this is how CPI can flourish. Half and half, public-private funding. And he looked at it and he could see his eyes really getting it. And this was fantastic. And you could see he was also thinking, well, maybe that will work with the other centres around the place that are not going to be funded after the bonfire. And must have been 6 weeks later, Ian and David came up to the Northeast and I had dinner with them. And he basically said, look, we want to take this model and we want to apply it and create a new structure where we take the other centres, which were the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in Sheffield, the Nuclear Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, also in Sheffield, the National Composites Centre at Bristol, the Manufacturing Technology Centre at Coventry, us, and the Advanced Forming Research Centre in Glasgow. And we want to put them together in a model, which we're going to call a TIC. Very unfortunate acronym. Technology Innovation Centre. So we were all known as TICs, which ticks are parasites, so we were instantly seen as parasitic. And the object of that exercise was to hold these 6 organisations in a place where we could work them and develop them and not have the danger of the bonfire getting in the way. And Ian went off and found some money, and we were, I wouldn't say safe, but we were in a much, much better place. Now, from that idea, we had to then create the working mechanism, because we weren't going to be allowed to be 6 centres and just carry on as we are. There had to be some additive from the process, because the public fund would go into just those 6 centres and we had to work out how to distribute it. And that's when the fun really, really started. Because what unwittingly had happened was we had taken the process industry, which is obviously traditionally chemicals, but also personal care, pharmaceuticals and such like, and we put it on into a same funding pot as the automotive industry and the aerospace industry. And if you try and judge those as equals, you can't. If you try and sort out what the priorities between them are, you can't. So it ended up with a very, very interesting situation, which required several adult conversations to sort out how we were going to distribute the funds. But the great thing is that the model for how the centre operated was based on CPI. Neville Hamlin, our finance director at the time, created the business model and the legal entity for what became known as the Catapults, still known as TICs at this point. And it was felt that once TSB had got this idea, it then started to, well, we can have these all over the place. We can have TICs in gene therapy, we can have TICs in offshore wind and all sorts of things. And it sort of grew a bit like Topsy. I said there were 2 things I remember about that meeting. The one was this absolute dawning on in Gray's eyes that we'd just walked in with the model that allowed him to have a purpose for the TSB and to keep CPI operating. The other one was one of the companies we've been working with, Polyphotonics, had one of its displays down in the TSB offices, and this worked on 600 volts DC. Nobody had bothered to put a back on the display, and I grabbed hold of this thing to straighten it up and probably got a 600 volt belt, which was embarrassing to say the least, because it was sort of, Polyphotonics working in conjunction with CPI. And there's the CEO from CPI nearly getting knocked across the room by it. So those 2 things stuck in my memory quite strongly. As we moved forwards, though, several other things started to stick in the memory. Like, when you're doing this, you start becoming very, very visible. And the Science and Technology Committee in the House of Commons started to be interested in it. So we got summons down to the select committees and gave evidence into there about how the UK moved forwards, etc. We got a seventh member given to us in the form of Warwick Manufacturing Group, because it was more automotive, but Warwick Manufacturing Group worked particularly with Jaguar Land Rover, which was a uniquely associated British brand. So it was important that that happened. And we spent a great deal of time working out how this lot was going to work, because we still had to bid for the money. So we spent a lot of time in Rolls-Royce's tower block in Victoria Street, pulling the business plan together with Rolls-Royce providing all the strategic planning and such like. And we pulled together a business plan which we then had to go and pitch at the TSB, which fortunately we were successful in. And then we got the money for 5 years. And that was as a 7 of us, not as a 6 of us. Running in parallel with that was then a naming competition. We can't be called TICs because we were pointing out, as I'd said all along in CPI, be careful not to make an acronym that you can pronounce. And TIC is infinitely pronounceable. So there was a naming competition, and I remember the 7 CEOs sitting there in bated breath with this naming consultant who said, Andrew, we're going to call them Catapults. And when you'd calmed down, you could see that was a really good name. It was all about acceleration. It was all about moving something from A to C. And that kind of really fitted in with where we were. But the formation of those catapults was a rescue mission from the government transition, but also was done with CPI as being a leading light. There was a lot of suggestion that CPI should lead it, or more specifically, that I might lead it. And that gave us the wherewithal to then start progressing and start making the centre-based propositions that we now have. Was it exciting? Was it good fun? On a good day, you could call it that. On a bad day, they were exceptionally frustrating activities, because AMRC was the title of the Advanced Manufacturing Centre is Advanced Manufacturing Centre with Boeing. And Boeing Aircraft was a very large player in that.
Yeah.
Whereas the work with the Composite Centre was with Airbus. So you ended up with, global leaders basically having their technologies in very close proximity in the catapult.
It's a little bit like the conversation or that moment around devolution and the circularity of these things. It's interesting. Literally just yesterday, I was with now we are the second generation of CEOs in the high value manufacturing catapult.
Yep.
Sitting together, 13 or so years on, 2 5-year funding deals behind us, a couple of 1-year deals as that became expedient. And yesterday we were talking about brands and names, and we were navigating the complexities of how do we articulate the demands of healthy living alongside the demands of sustainability in industry, clean growth, and increasingly our defence and security, which are the sort of 4 big priorities that sit within the high value manufacturing catapult, and all centres are trying to articulate their unique offer within those domains, if we want to call them that, in front of what is now Innovate UK, the old the evolution of the technology strategy board. I think that the conversation has changed, the fundamentals haven't.
No,
and it's interesting to me that a model created in the environment that you've described under such pressure and tension has survived. I think it's got a great record of success now, but it's been held together by force of will at times, and that still remains the case. It's not a comfortable environment, but it's a necessary one. And I think if we could have thought of something else in the meantime, we would probably have invented it by now, but we haven't. And that tells me that its purpose is still needed. And I know from previous conversations we've had that, the original architects, you and others, when asked how long will this take, the answer was
40 years. Yes.
That's the significance of the commitment to shift, the level of economic impact that we want to see from the translation of research. So we're still not we're only just into our teens in that journey. We've come out of our teens as CPI, and the positioning of those two things to me remains fascinating. Can we hold that longevity of thinking? Going back to the description of if CPI is the answer, what's the question?
Yep.
And the question is, how well are we going to navigate this journey, this valley of death? And we're still at it. We can show some success, but we know there's still a heck of a lot more to do. It's just very, very interesting to put all those things together in one conversation and to take a long-term view of this, not a short-term view. Another great piece of work that's happened as a result of the high-value manufacturing catapult is recognizing we all approach the topic of skills slightly differently, somewhat dependent on the need in the geographies that we were in, the kind of technologies we were working and developing. And some of our fellow centres have, with a university-backed environment, have a very substantial offer in what you might call training. One of the things that I think we've done brilliantly is to recognise that working with advanced technology or working with the next generation of technologies gives us a unique insight into what are the features of that technology that will require us to change the training environments in which we're working and the kind of accreditations that will be needed. And the best example is always electric vehicles. How do we pivot from an environment where we've developed a whole set of skills and a whole supply chain and therefore a whole workforce around the internal combustion engine that over time will need to pivot into the development and maintenance of an electric drive, and being able to articulate that and describe, and what we call foresighting that the skills requirements of that technology has given rise to a new language of foresighting and alongside skills. And in our world, in CPI's world, we've been able to contribute brilliantly to that in areas like RNA, certainly in areas of digital manufacturing, and then in time, make our own contributions around electric vehicles and new classes of therapy. So our skills offer, I think, has matured alongside our technology, and we've learned to right-size ourselves within that whole conversation. In where's our real additionality, and where do we leave skills and training to the experts in that area, but we add our foresighted perception or our foresighted reality of, in this technology area, you're going to need to be able to do this, and to hand that over almost in packages of thinking and packages of work. That's been a real strength of the high-value manufacturing catapult as well.
It's good to hear that the HVMC is moving to be more joined up rather than having 7 centres who, to a certain extent, grated. In fact, the fact we kept it together for 12 years was an achievement.
Phenomenal.
And now we've moved into that regime of we're not grating, we are looking for the synergies. I think is really, really exciting, because that's where we've got to go. Join the thing up. And CPI has a tremendous role as a convener which you and I have talked about.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of exciting. I think you're absolutely right when you say there's sort of rotation, and we'll probably go around several more times in the next 20 or so years. But the fundamentals of the model are so basic and tied back to how our economy and how our invention processes work, is it can't be anything else but right. It has to be right. And I'm interested in having to pass the reins over to you right in the middle of COVID, right at the start of COVID. And you are the second generation of CEOs, and the first generation were known as the sort of, there was a lot of adult conversation, and a lot of
unrepeatable
words. And the fact that we've moved into a more mature, emotionally mature generation, for me, is absolutely magical. What I'm interested in is we haven't really changed the industrial sectors that we're looking at. And it's still, if you go back to Maslow, it's still being driven by basic human need. So I'm very hopeful for the next 20 years, but I'd really love to hear from you what your thoughts are about the next 20 years, because the job won't be done by then even.
No, it won't. The fundamentals are still there, what you've articulated, the fundamentals. And I still think winning the argument for the longevity of the model is a constant. You would hope it would be intuitive, but it isn't. I think we just got to accept that I think as a country we've invested hugely in our academic excellence, and the scale of that, the power of that conversation, particularly in the public sector, means that you're quite often, it does feel like you're shouting into the wind sometimes. And where we've developed great relationships with our academic colleagues, they are now shouting with us. And I think that's enormously powerful, particularly as academia goes through its own challenges in terms of scale and affordability. So I think the next 20 years will see us journeying together even more. And I think perhaps having to, maybe reset our parameters a little around how far academia comes into this world of translation, and where organisations like CPI meet them to continue that journey. And I think those boundaries will continue to be quite fluid. The other thing that I think is, and I've said this in other forums, that the role of the private sector is changing too. And perhaps where, the way you've described, the Northeast as having these very large established industries. I started my industrial career in the shipyards down the road here, recognising organisations of 5,000 people, 10,000 people as being the norm. ICI down the road with 30,000 people on Teesside.
Yep.
And that's pretty much all gone. The characterisation of CPI as an evolution from that world needed an equal response from the private sector to be able to stimulate the kind of activities that CPI was able to influence and support. But that wasn't going to sit in a lab in ICI or in a metallurgy facility supporting the shipyards. That's now coming through the entrepreneurial spirit that's grown through spin-outs and through university research, and increasingly is being stimulated by private equity. We'd love a lot more, but private equity's role in this next 20 years, I think, is going to be as essential as the public sector's role has been in the first 20. And that is probably the most exciting feature of the next 20 years, is the degree to which the things that we feel very confident about, so in the way that we can create deal flow as the private sector will see it, in having the insight and the instinct and the practice to look at a piece of technology and say, we know that that's got a better than evens chance of being successful. And private equity's clinical view of commercialization and route to market and financial reality, the mix of those two things is a really, really fascinating and very uncomfortable place to sit at times in a good way, because you're forming really, really harsh judgments about the likelihood of success. And our hope and aspiration and belief in the potential in technology and private equity's hard view of what will the market accept, what will the market take, and how would it allow these products to come into the market, is a really, really fascinating space for CPI to be at the moment. If you pivot that into, what are the really big topics? We grew up knowing, as chemical engineers, knowing that circularity of processes is where you get your efficiency. Suddenly, that has entirely new meaning when we talk about sustainability. And you throw the huge advances in digital technology, call it artificial intelligence if you want to, but what you and I would probably have recognized as just really, really good advanced process control. And suddenly sustainability becomes a whole new arena in which new products and processes, private equity investment, and doing the right thing for the planet can meet each other as equals and do remarkable things. And I think you can carry the same conversation into human health, and the adoption of that the realities of what can a public sector health service afford, what will a private insurance type market value, and how do we bring those things together to say there's a huge amount of personal quality of life to be unlocked here, still maintaining that those hard disciplines of technical reality and financial sustainability. So those things for me are the things that over the next 20 years are going to be, I think they're going to really, really drive the innovation environment in the way that you've described the first 20 years.
I think that's brilliant, Frank, because we had the view that, being somewhat arrogant, that CPI could be considered to be an implementer of government policy. And looking at healthcare, looking at sustainability, looking at engineering, biology, looking at biomanufacturing, and particularly looking at multidisciplinarity, which we've always done, we've got CPI, or you've got CPI now, but we've got it, let's say, together in a place where we really know no boundaries. And that, I think, is what you've just said. And I think for me, the ability to bring in the private equity side of things and to help them to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, I think is absolutely brilliant. Music to my ears to hear you saying that.
Thank you.
If you're going to develop high technology businesses with high technology in them, you need high technology competent people. And I think we'd always envisaged that CPI was like a conveyor belt. We would move each business. It doesn't work like a clock. It's not clockwork yet. But I wouldn't be surprised to see, if it wasn't a regular feature of our business, that we had people who worked with us in CPI and then went either back to their parent company, our customer, or left CPI and joined our customer. That would be a perfectly natural and, in fact, to be encouraged process, because you can't run a high technology business in the northeast of England without skilled people, money, the technology, the facilities. And so you're trying to construct an either 4 or 5 part offer. And I think people and the skills then become very important.
We've talked the language of impact for many years. And I think we're now quite skilled and articulate about impact. Be worth just getting your thoughts on how you think that, what relevance you think that has in the future. What's the enduring relevance of our economic impact in this next 20 years?
Impact is the answer to the question of so what. So if we're the answer to whatever the question was, which we've talked about at length, then how do you know the answer's working? It's the so what thing. And if you go back to the sort of economics of the Northeast versus the rest of the UK, or the Northeast and the rest of the UK, then what you realise, there is such a GDP gap between the north of the country and the south of the country that you've got to start thinking about leverage. So you put £1 in here, what's the factor you have to leverage it by to get the advantage that will start to close the gap? And for some time, we've been identified, particularly going back as far as the work with MIT, that CPI had to produce a leverage of between 5 and 10 times the money that was put into it. Now, what does that mean? How do you measure leverage? You measure leverage by the investment that's being made by the companies you're working with, by the jobs they're creating, by the fiscal impact of those companies. You're looking at the number of new products and processes that you're developing, and you very quickly isolate some core measures that say, are we making a material difference here? Now, I have no doubt whatsoever that we are, and in fact, you showed at the board meeting this week that our leverage on just cash co-investment is between 5 and 7 times, which is right in the sweet spot of between 5 and 10, which is fantastic. I think that's got to become an overwhelming argument as we move forwards over the next 20 years, because we've got to win the argument that says this is a 40-year journey. Look at what we've done in the first 20. What do we need to do in the second 20? And it has got to be about societal benefit in terms of wealth creation for UK PLC. And the only way that you can articulate that, the only way you can do that and let people audit it, so you sort of throw open the doors and say, come in, let's get rid of all the smoke and mirrors. Come in and actually measure the stuff and agree with us that this is the impact that we're having. Then I think that's got to be where it is. Now, the interesting thing, as soon as we started talking about impact and getting impact measures in, so our collaborators started talking about impact. And it's a joining force, it's a convening force. So when we work with a university, we increase their impact and they increase our impact. And as everyone is aware, the research excellence framework, the REF as it's called, increasingly now 25% of the marks given in that framework, which tells you where that university's research is. Is it world class or is it also ran, which obviously affects the amount of money they're given, is impact. And as we start to work with multidisciplinary research in universities, we're starting to work with funders and reducing their risk. If you go back to the risk argument, it starts over here, infinitely risky, gets down to the point at which private sector will invest. By getting everybody inside the tent, using a common language and working together, I think that's going to be impact. I think impact is the common language that will drive us down the vision that you have for the next 20 years. And I think we will get people talking about the so what's. And it isn't so what in 3 months' time or 6 months' time. It is the wealth that is created over the next 10 years and how that helps us, particularly as we're working in the Northeast, even though we have a global focus, how that helps us bring the Northeast's overall position up. In other words, the population of the Northeast becomes stronger and better than it was had we not been there. So it's pretty important in my mind. It's probably one of the better measures that we've had to deal with. And since we invented it, we understand it.
Yeah, indeed. So, Nigel, thank you for your insight and your time. I've always found our conversations fascinating. From the very first time I stepped across the threshold at CPI, when I wasn't looking for a job and you weren't looking to hire anybody, and yet here we are all these years later, still having these fascinating conversations. So thank you for your time and your enduring commitment to CPI. It's been another fascinating time talking to you. Thanks.
Thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've loved hearing about where you think we're going. I'm absolutely on board with that. I really value still being engaged with CPI. It has been part of me for 20 years, and long may that continue until I get boring and out of touch and you sort of say, clear out the way. But no, it's been really good, and I want to contribute to CPI as we go forwards, and I wish CPI every possible success, because we've come this far and we've got a long way to go, and I've no doubts. There's no reason to believe we can't be successful. It's absolutely an incredible story. Well done to you.
Thank you.